Hello, everyone. Welcome back to AP Microeconomics. For the next few weeks, we will cover supply and demand. This week, we will cover and go over demand. So, now let's get started. So in this lesson, you will learn how to define the quantity demanded of a good or service and illustrate it using a demand schedule and a demand curve. Distinguish between the following pairs of concepts: demand and quantity demanded, demand schedule, and demand curve, movement along and shift in a demand curve. And lastly, identify demand shifters and determine whether a change in a demand shifter causes the demand curve to shift to the right or to the left. Now let's go over the law of demand. So the law of demand is the common relationship that a higher price leads to a higher quantity demanded of a certain good or service, and a lower price leads to a higher quantity demanded while other variables are held constant. The law of demand assumes that all other variables that affect demand are held constant. Now, this table shows the quantity demanded at each price. This is called a demand schedule, as you can tell in this chart. Now, let's look at an example: the price of gasoline. In this table, price in this case is measured in dollars per gallon of gasoline. The quantity demanded is measured in million of gallons over some time period and over some geographic area. Here is a demand curve. So basically, a demand curve is the graphical or visual of the demand schedule. So basically, what you saw in the table, which was a demand schedule, this is what a demand curve is, how it's graphed. So a demand curve shows that relationship between price and quantity demanded in a graph. As you can see in the graph, the price per gallon on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. Please be aware that this graph is an exception to the normal rule in math that the independent variable, which is the x-axis, goes on the horizontal axis and the dependent variable y goes on the vertical. Economics is different from math. The demand curve shows that as price rises, quantity demanded decreases and vice versa. One important note to keep in mind is that in economic terminology, demand is not the same as quantity demanded. When economists talk about demand, they mean the relationship between a range of prices and the quantities demanded at those prices, as illustrated by a demand curve or demand schedule. When economists talk about quantity demanded, they mean only a certain point on the demand curve or one quantity on the demand curve. In short, or to keep it simple, demand refers to the curve and quantity demanded refers to the specific point on the curve. So there are some factors that affect demand. So one is the willingness to purchase. A desire to buy and buy it depends on what economists call taste and preferences. If you neither need or want something, you won't be willing to buy it. And also, lastly, the ability to purchase. Income is important. These factors matter both for demand by an individual and demand by the market as a whole. So, as you remember in our first lecture, that ceteris paribus means all else equal. We will use this concept to understand supply and demand for the next couple more weeks. A demand curve or supply curve, which we will cover in further detail, is a relationship between two and only two variables: price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. The assumption is if that no relevant economic factor other than the product's price are changing. Any given demand or supply curve is based on the ceteris paribus assumption that all else is held equal. A demand curve or equal curve is a relationship between two and only two variables when all other variables are held equal. If all else is not held equal, then the laws of supply and demand will not necessarily hold. Obviously, there are some factors that affect demand, and we will get to that later. However, I want to show you a graph depicting the shifts of demand. So let's do that right now. So here is the graph. So this graph shows the shifts in demand, and here's a car example. So a change in prices affects the quantity demanded. Price, however, is not the only thing that influences demand. Now, let's look at this graph that I have shown here. This graph shows the initial demand for automobiles at D0. At point Q, for example, if the price is $20,000 per car, the quantity of cars demanded is 18 million. D0 shows how the quantity of cars demanded would change as a result of a higher or lower price. For example, if the price of a car rose to $22,000, the quantity demanded would increase to 17 million at point R. The original demand curve 0, like every demand curve, is based on the ceteris paribus assumption that no other economically relevant factors change. Now imagine that the economy expands in a way that raises the incomes of many people, making cars more affordable. How will this affect demand? How can we show this graphically? So, as you remember in the table, and I'll show you that in a few seconds, the price of cars is still 20,000, but with higher incomes, the quantity demanded has now increased to 20 million cars, shown at point S. As a result of the higher income levels, the demand curve shifts to the right to the new demand curve D1, indicating an increase in demand. Table 1, as I will show next, shows clearly that this increased demand would occur at every price, not just the original one. So as you can see in this table here, table 1 as here, it says when a demand curve shifts, it does not mean that the quantity demanded by every individual buyer changes by the same amount. In this example, not everyone would have higher or lower income, and not everyone would buy or not buy an additional car. So, normal good versus inferior good. So, a normal good is a product whose demand rises when income rises and vice versa. So, in normal goods, as income rises, many people will buy fewer generic brand goods and buy more name brand groceries. They are less likely to buy used cars and more likely to buy new cars. They'll less likely to rent an apartment but more likely to own a home and so on. An inferior good is a product whose demand falls when income rises and vice versa. In inferior goods, when income increases, the demand curve shifts to the left. Now, there are some additional factors that shift demand curves, and they include taste and preferences. 2, the consumption and size of the population. 3, the prices of related goods. And lastly, expectations. Now, income, also, like I said, isn't the only thing that causes a shift in demand. Graphically speaking, the new demand curve lies either to the right, an increase, or to the left, a decrease of the original demand curve. So we'll take a look at these. Let's take a look at these in further detail. All right, changes in taste or preferences. Changes like these are largely due to shifts in taste, which change the quantity of a good demanded at every price. That is a shift the demand curve for that good. Rightward for chicken and leftward for beef. So from 1980 to 2012, the per person consumption of chicken by Americans rose from 33 pounds per year to 81 pounds per year. And consumption of beef fell from 77 pounds per year to 57 pounds per year, according to the USDA. So chicken went rightward because the consumption of chicken increased, and beef went leftward because the consumption of beef decreased. Now, changes in composition of the population. So, a the proportion of elderly people in the United States population is rising. It rose from 9.8% in 1970 to 12.6% in 2000 and will be projected by the United States Census Bureau 20% of the population by 2030. A society with relatively more children like the United States in the 1960s will have greater demand for goods and services like tricycles and daycare facilities. So, for example, and this is certainly true in the 1960s because my parents were born in the 1960s and they come from very large families. So my dad has 8 brothers and sisters, and my mom has 5 brothers and sisters. So they come from very large families. So as you can tell, for they're considered their generation is considered to be the baby boomers. Now now, a society with relatively more elderly persons, as the United States is projected to have by 2030, has a higher demand for nursing homes and hearing aids. Similarly, changes in the size of the population can affect the demand for housing and many other goods. Each of these changes in demand will be shown as a shift in the demand curve. Okay, number 4 is changes in the prices of related goods. So, a substitute is a good or service that can be used in place of another good or service. A lower price for a substitute decreases demand for the other product. Complements are goods that are often used together because consumption of one good tends to enhance the consumption of the other. The demand for a product can also be affected by changes in the price of related goods, such as substitutes or complements. So, a good example for a complement is say you have an American Girl doll. And with your American Girl doll, you want to get her shoes and clothes, a car, a purse, a dollhouse. So, those are complements to the main good, the American Girl doll, and having accessories, so additives to it. A substitute could be anything that would substitute. So, for example, I know instead of getting internet using our laptops, now the substitute will be our phone. So, we mainly go to our phones to search and surf the internet. So, that'll be a good example of a substitute. All right, lastly is number 5, changes in expectations about future prices. So, shift in demand takes place when a change in some economic factor other than the current price causes a different quantity to be demanded at every price. So, the price of a good affects the quantity demanded. It is also true that expectations about the future price or expectations about taste and preferences income, and so on can affect demand. So these are some of the changes that will shift a demand curve, some of the factors. So next, and this will also conclude the first part of supply and demand. So next week we are going to go over supply. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can certainly let me know, and I'll be happy to assist you. And I will see you next week. Bye. What is demand? Demand is the amount of some good or service consumers are willing and able to purchase at each price. Demand is based off of needs and wants. A consumer may be able to differentiate between a need and a want, but from an economist perspective, they are the same thing. Demand is also based on the ability to pay. If you can't afford to pay for it, you have no effective demand. Price is what the buyer pays for a unit of the specific good or service. The total number of units purchased at that price is called the quantity demanded. Quantity demanded in relation to a graph is a rise in the price of a good or service almost always decreases the quantity of that good or service demanded. In contrast, a fall in price will increase the quantity demanded.